Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. John, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Would you like to introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Well, my name is John Mancino. I reside in California. Lived here my whole life, and spent 30 years in manufacturing management. For the last dozens or so years, I've owned a private security company, and I just everything I'm passionate about, I go after. It's just been my nature since I was in sixth grade, believe it or not. Went after music after seeing the Beatles with my good friend Doug Smith. We played music all over California, even played at Greek Theater a couple times. And I became interested in the JFK assassination because Kennedy had driven by our school in Los Angeles in, during the 1960 presidential election. And the day that he was assassinated, they let us go home from school early. All my friends wanted to go out and play ball. I said, no, I'm going to watch TV. They said, you can watch TV? What for? I said, I'm watching the news. So here I am. I'm just in sixth grade, so I'm like pretty young. And so I wound up sitting in front of the TV, glued to it, until our parents made us kids go to bed, and then they went to their room, and I sneaked up and started watching the news again and watched them parade Lee Harvey Oswald out first time before the press. And I thought, even as a young guy, this guy looks awfully calm and cool and collected and confident, and was very defiant in terms of shooting anyone, and said so. So I thought, this doesn't register properly. So anyway, even the chief of police, who I met years later, Jessie Curry, initially indicated to the press that we have our man. And I can tell you that's not how he felt in the early to mid 70s. So I wound up reading everything I could get my hands on, literally everything I could get my hands on. The first book was Mark Lane's book, Rush to Judgment. But I wound up years later in the 70s, long after meeting Marguerite Oswald and Jessie Curry, hooked up with David Lifton, who wrote the book Best Evidence. And that book was the first book to ever publish JFK's autopsy photos, which were clearly different, showed the difference between what the Dallas doctors who tried to save Kennedy and what the Bethesda doctors who performed the autopsy showed, where the wounds were. So I was really stunned. And to his dying day, Dr. McClellan, who was at Parkland Hospital, refused to change his testimony and stuck to his feeling that President Kennedy was shot in the throat from the front. So all these things were very interesting to me. I wound up meeting a guy because of my relationship with Marguerite Oswald. A newspaper article on that relationship produced a guy who somehow got my office number. I met with him, and he wound up admitting that he worked with two guys in the CIA during Operation Mongoose, which was a CIA-backed plot to kill Castro. When that was terminated by Robert Kennedy, those guys turned their sights on President Kennedy. Not the guy that I met. He backed out, and quite frankly, he lived in more states than I can recall, staying away from the other two guys. So this is how I got involved, and it wound up evolving from that relationship all the way to Attorney General Ed Meese under Ronald Reagan, who told Baxter Ward, who had been the ABC news director on the West Coast before becoming an LA County supervisor for a couple of terms, and then went back to ABC and did commentaries. And Baxter Ward took information I provided and this other individual provided, by the name of Dick Margison, who was also investigated by the Warren Commission investigators and the FBI and the CIA, and took that information to Ed Meese, and Ed Meese came back and said, I wouldn't touch this with a 10-foot pole. Too many people are dead. So at that point, I backed out of it. And I spent most of my time working in the area of criminal justice, trying to make sure that life inmates who had once, by the way, been sentenced to death, but having the California Supreme Court twice in the 70s overturn the death penalty, and there was no such thing at the time as life without the possibility of parole, except for train wrecking. So you could commit murder, rape, child molestation, and never be executed. So I focused my attention on that, and I got involved with petition drives. What happened was the old Los Angeles Herald Examiner had an area column, and it was just brief stories. And I noticed one that said, talked about the pending parole of Sirhan Sirhan, convicted assassin of Robert F. Kennedy. And I said, this doesn't ring true. Talking to my friend Mike Groff, we worked together. So I called the parole board and found out that Sirhan Sirhan had been granted a release date in his very first parole hearing. They wanted him out of the country. So I drafted a petition, and 4 of our friends gathered together on college campuses after work and on shopping malls on the weekends for about a month, and collected 12,000 signatures and hundreds of letters. Went to the parole board, became good friends with the then vice chairman, Robert Roos, and Bob and I became lifelong friends until he passed away a little more than a year ago. And he eventually became the chairman of the parole board. So I was the first private citizen allowed to testify about in favor of a rescission hearing to take away that parole date. Because Sirhan was scheduled to be released on September 1st, 1984, and could have been released earlier if if more good time credits were applied to his case. So went back. This was in September of 1981. Went back in November of 1981, testified along with Deputy DA Larry Trapp of Los Angeles and Sirhan's attorneys Luke McKissick. And of course, McKissick was trying to keep Sirhan's parole date intact, and we testified against that release. The board overwhelmingly ruled to hold a rescission hearing in April of '82. I was the first private citizen allowed to attend a parole rescission hearing for a life inmate. So after about a week, the board, through testimony and completing, they took away Sirhan's parole date. And so we were successful in our effort, but at that time, however, Solano County Superior Court Judge Ellis Randall ruled later on that public outcry, which was our petition drive and letter drive, could not be the sole reason to rescind the parole date. So he ruled that Powell in the Onionfield case, where we also gathered petitions with the daughter of the slain police officer, Valerie Campbell. You probably might recall that Ian Campbell, LA County police officer, was shot to death in the infamous Onionfield in Bakersfield. So we wound up drafting a petition, submitted 31,500 signatures to the parole board, and the parole board came back and rescinded the parole date. But Solano County Superior Court Judge Ellis Randall ruled that our public outcry was not a sufficient reason to take away a parole date. So we wound up going to the First District Court of Appeals in San Francisco. We won there, and eventually we won at the California Supreme Court level, and Gregory Eulis Powell wound up dying in prison. All this publicity between the Sirhan case and the Onionfield case garnered the attention of Doris Tate, the mother of slain actress Sharon Tate, who called me in the middle of the night one night because somebody had submitted 900 signatures to have Leslie Van Houten released, who, by the way, just a week and a half ago was released from prison. Originally sentenced to death, then sentenced to life in prison, and now is out on the streets. So when Doris Tate came to me, we drafted a petition. over the course of the next couple years, we gathered over 1.4 million signatures to keep all of the Manson family in prison. We attended parole hearings. Doris testified. Then, following Doris's passing, her daughter Patty took the mantle. When Patty passed away from cancer, then Deborah Tate, who was a longtime friend of mine, she took up the mantle herself and has worked not only to keep the Manson family in prison, but also other lesser known, less publicity generating cases of murderers that had long histories of violent crime, starting at very young ages. So it's just, I learned from a discussion I had with the former chief counsel for the parole board in California that the public can have an effect in this area of their government if they stand up and say something, get off their couches, write a letter, sign a petition, call their legislator and say, this is ridiculous. These laws don't say what they mean. And I wound up researching life in prison because in 1978, we finally had life without the possibility of parole for crimes other than train wrecking. However, if you read the law, the governor and or the state Supreme Court can commute those sentences to life with the possibility of parole. So I went to George Deukmejian, who was the governor of California at the time, and I wound up drafting a state constitutional amendment to remove that authority from the governor. Couldn't touch the Supreme Court, but I was able to draft a state constitutional amendment to have the governor's power taken away to reduce those sentences to life with the possibility of parole. His legal affairs secretary, Vance Ray, called me, and I went to Sacramento. And when I was asked why I drafted this, I said, it's very simple. The state constitution and the federal constitution, they forbid ambiguity in the law. And if life without parole doesn't mean life without parole, I don't know what's more ambiguous. So Deukmejian and Vance Ray said, you walk these halls and you get a legislator in both houses of the legislature to introduce such a bill, will publicly endorse this constitutional amendment. So I went to State Senator Robert Presley, who was fairly liberal on most issues, but not on criminal justice issues. He was very staunchly against the release of life inmates, murderers, rapists, child molesters. So he agreed to introduce a bill. Willie Brown, who was the Speaker of the Assembly at the time, would not allow a single Assembly person to sign on to that bill. So it wound up in the trash can. And so we just continued our efforts to push for other pieces of legislation to beef up criminal justice. We worked on the Victims' Bill of Rights, Prop 8 in 1982, Prop 4, which was a bail initiative to deny bail to capital murder cases. And just we were successful in passing some laws, pushing the legislature to get more involved with criminal justice and protect the public. Because no matter what issue you're talking about, in politics, energy, the economy in general, public safety is paramount. Government's most important function is that of protecting its citizen. And I can tell you, they're not doing a very good job. In 1952, which was the year I was born, there were 260 murders in the whole state of California. The year I got involved, there were 3,411. That's a more than 1,300% increase in homicides in this state. Well, we all know that our population from 1952 to 1980 did not go up more than 1,300%. It's outrageous, and the public doesn't know what's going on, and people become victims every single day in this country, and it's outrageous. The government is not performing its most important function.
You mentioned a lot of things, but I want to bring it back to some of the first things you mentioned. I'm sure we'll have to do other episodes on RFK and all that as well too. But I want to talk about some of the JFK stuff because that is something for the past year I've been just passionate about and very focused into. But you said you met Jessie Curry. You got to tell me how that occurred, man, and that he had different thoughts in his mid-70s if Oswald was.
Yeah, it's interesting because I found him I was a little bit nervous about meeting with him. He had published his own book. It wasn't a very long book, but he had some pretty pertinent information about JFK's assassination. So I just called him up and I said, "Look, I'm a freelance writer. I just want to interview you. I'll respect your wishes. We'll do it however you want." So he invited me to Dallas. We sat on his patio at a nice little table on the patio, and I tape recorded the interview. And I finally got down to the question. I said, "I know initially you thought you quote unquote had your man, but I'd like to know now, after all this additional information has come out over the years, and again, this is in the early to mid 70s when this interview took place, do you still feel the same? Do you believe Lee Harvey Oswald assassinated President Kennedy?" And the words that left his lips were basically, "Turn off your tape recorder." So I took a deep breath. I respected his wishes. I did what he asked. I turned my tape recorder off, and he said, "I thought he did," until he sat in on a couple of interrogations, one in which Oswald said to the detective, "I was on the first floor. I had been in the lunchroom and then walked out toward the front of the building, but there were two African American ladies in the lunchroom at the same time." This is at the time of the shooting. So a couple hours later, they went back to interrogate Oswald again, and Jesse Curry stood in and he just leaned against the door and with his hands behind his back and just listened to the interrogation. And the detective said, "We talked to those two ladies, and they don't recall seeing you in the lunchroom." At that moment, Curry said that Oswald stood up, leaned over the table between separating him and the detective, and said, "How did I know they were in there unless I was there? Because nobody else except the building manager, Roy Truly, was in the building. Everybody was outside watching the parade." So at that moment, Jesse Curry said he finally had doubts, but he never shared them. In fact, he refused to let me turn my tape recorder back on because, of course, I was going to follow up and say, "What changed your mind? And when did this happen?" And, these questions that he just answered, I was going to ask for him to answer them on tape, which he refused to do.
Did he ever express why he couldn't talk about it on tape?
Well, first of all, probably I'm assuming again I'm a young guy at this time, barely in my early 20s, and I think he had a reputation he wanted to protect. He had a family he wanted to protect. By this time, a lot of people had been killed. A lot of people died. In fact, if you ever saw the movie Executive Action with Robert Ryan, Will Geer, and Burt Lancaster about the assassination that was released in 1973, um, at the end of that movie, while the credits are rolling up the screen, there's a narrator who says that a London Sunday Times actuary indicated that 18 material witnesses involved directly or indirectly with the assassination of President Kennedy, all being dead, the odds of them all being dead by January 1967 were 100,000 trillion to one. So I have to assume that that also may have played a role. I mean, one of the officers that was in the parade, he was killed. Uh, People died from all kinds of crazy things: karate chops, induced heart attacks. People have been in perfect health. So, I mean, I can't put words into his mouth. I can just only speculate, to be frankly honest. I just don't think he wanted to get any more involved. And I was really, frankly, surprised he let me interview him.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Is that rare for him? I'm curious because like Ruth Payne does interviews all the time, but I would think for a lot of these people, it gets really hard rehashing the same things over and over again. And I do believe conspiracy, but there is some super conspiracies out there that are like, that's a little bit too much for me. Like Jack Ruby didn't shoot Oswald is one that I've come across a couple of times. So I would think he'd be exhausted just to want to interview.
It's pretty crazy. You know, there are a lot of publicity seekers out there, and you know, in all my research, the single biggest turning point for me wasn't due to my intelligence and my you know my tough research. It fell in my lap, and it was because of the newspaper article on my relationship with Marguerite Oswald, Lee's mother. Um, this guy contacted me because he read the article, and from that point forward, I learned a lot more than I'd ever thought I might learn to my dying day. And as a result, I'm fairly certain that the truth may never truly all come out. But I can tell you this without the slightest hesitation that Lee Harvey Oswald had nothing to do with the assassination of President Kennedy. And not only that, he wasn't even involved at all, much less behind the rifle, and was set up. And he may have been set up all the way back to the very late 50s, early 60s. If you recall, Kennedy was not supposed to be elected. Um, Everybody assumed that Nixon, you know, the vice president, was going to be elected. And I think it threw a wrench in things. And the CIA was involved in numerous activities that Kennedy wasn't made aware of until it was too late. For example, the Bay of Pigs. And two of the individuals that were in a photograph after I met with Dick Margerson, with a friend of mine, two people were in a photograph down in those Florida Keys that had no business being in the same photograph together. Not whatsoever, had no business being in the same photograph. One was a guy that offered Oswald as the patsy, and the other one was the guy who accepted him as the patsy and began to set Oswald up. I mean, he was a perfect patsy, gone to the Soviet Union, tried to renounce his American citizenship, but he was sent by the CIA, in my opinion, was sent to by the CIA to the Soviet Union to determine whether a private citizen could infiltrate the Soviet Union. When it finally looked like he wasn't going to be successful, he was allowed to bring his Russian-born wife, Marina, back to the United States, paid for by the feds, the State Department. So it was a very convoluted case that started way back. As I said, Kennedy was not supposed to be elected.
Could I ask about your relationship with Marguerite Oswald? You got to explain to me what she was like. I just see photos and videos of her, and I'm like, I'm curious because that relationship, they always say like Oswald didn't like his mother and all this. I'm just curious what she had to say.
Well, it's kind of interesting. I had seen an article in the old National Enquirer where this guy interviewed her, and he was not very kind to her. So I tracked her down, called her up, told her that I didn't believe her son assassinated the president, and asked if I could interview her. So I flew to Dallas. I arrived in Dallas and wound up getting a motel room. Again, I think I was maybe 22 years old, something like that. I can't remember exactly. So, so I set up an interview. Next morning, I called her up and said, I'm getting ready to drive to Fort Worth. And she changed her mind. So I must have spent 45 minutes or an hour. I can't remember exactly, but I spent a long time convincing her to let me go ahead and come over and interview her. So I did. Within 15, 20 minutes, less than a half an hour, we were like friends. I mean, she was startled and surprised that I was, first of all, on her side, and in terms of not believing that Lee had anything to do with Kennedy's assassination, but also because she felt more comfortable that I wasn't there to take advantage of her like other writers had and people that had interviewed her. I found her to be a warm individual, sad. I mean, I can't count the number of times that she'd break out in tears, and not just because of the loss of her son, but she lost her job, fired from her job, which couldn't happen today. She was a registered nurse. They couldn't, with the labor laws that are on the books today, she couldn't be fired over that. but lost friends, lost family. Um, Lee's older brother Robert, who was a strange guy, didn't like him. He didn't like me, but he did not defend his brother to his own mother, and never got to see Marina, her daughter-in-law, and Lee's children, June, Lee, and Rachel, and pretty lonely life. Had to retire on a mere pittance of Social Security. I can't remember what it was, but I mean, you could never survive on it, that's for sure. And consequently, I took her out to lunch, first time I met her, and she had one favorite restaurant, and it was Long John Silver's. She loved fish and chips, so I took her to Long John Silver's, and she just it was like she couldn't believe that somebody would go out of their way because of how she'd been mistreated in the past by reporters and writers and novelists and stuff. So she couldn't believe that somebody would go out of their way to actually, excuse me, be kind to her. It was, and she was a little on edge from time to time. She would, let's say, hold back things. But eventually we became very good friends. Later on, years later, when the House Select Committee on Assassinations began their work and began to hold public hearings on television, she would call me every other day and say, they're wrong about this, or, oh, this is a good day, this is a good day for us. And it was really interesting. And one day she had, excuse me, my throat is dry. Hold on one second. One day she had misplaced my phone number. Well, my dad's name is John also. He was John Joseph, and I'm John Dennis. So she looked it up through information. She called my dad. She starts ranting and raving about the committee hearings that day, and my father said, "Oh my God, it must be Marguerite Oswald." And she said, "Yes, you want my son." So he gave her my number. But I found her to be very warm, in spite of the way she had to live after the assassination. Um, she was lived a very lonely life, sad life. Excuse me, got sinus trouble today from all the pollen. But anyway, I found her to be very nice, very sweet, nothing like what the press painted her as. She's very intelligent. She knew things that I didn't know, shared things with me that I didn't know about, even documents. One particular state document she would not give me a copy of, but state document that inferred that Lee was intelligence. And so she also shared with me her conversation with Lee at the jail that night after the assassination took place. And by the way, I shared that with David Lifton, who had written the book Best Evidence, which was the first time the autopsy photos were published, the autopsy photos of JFK. And in that conversation, she said, "Lee, I found a document. Are you Office of Naval Intelligence? You CIA? What's going on here?" And he kept telling her, "Mom, everything's going to be okay. Leave it alone. Everything's going to be fine. Just give it a couple days. I'm going to get my attorney, tell him exactly what to look for, where to find it, and this is all going to be over. Just leave it alone." So I shared that with David Lifton, and then David Lifton put it in his sequel, which I have no idea where it's at, because David, last time I talked to him was not long before he passed away.
Yeah, I talked to him too.
Last December, and I didn't know he had passed away. I was actually trying to find him because I didn't get an answer to my last email or phone call, and his phone stayed on for a while. But anyway, I shared that information with him, and God only knows where his files are. He had asked me if I would take control. I don't know if he was feeling ill or what, but he asked me to take control of his files that were not far from where I currently live in Orange County, California, in a storage unit. And at the time I was moving, I couldn't do it at the time. So I said, "Let me get back to you when I get settled." And then I never heard back from him. this is strange. So after settling in where I'm at now, and had a couple new clients that I had to take care of. I tried to reach him and couldn't find him, and then learned he passed away.
Yeah, Matt Dohit has I think a lot of David Lifton's files and stuff he was working on. Matt Dohit, I can send you his info if you want.
Please do, because that information that I gave him alone is valuable. Not only what I just shared, but also the Jessie Curry information, and David was shocked by that. He was disturbed as well that Jessie Curry would not go on record saying the same things that he said to me off record. Because, when you've got the chief of police contradicting what he initially said, I mean, vehemently, he was completely puzzled. And I said, well, if you look at the photograph that was taken through the front windshield where Kennedy's arms are raising up to his throat. You can look through that car windshield and you can see a guy standing in the doorway of the Texas School Book Depository in the identical clothes that Lee Harvey Oswald wore that day. So so that was puzzling to Jessie Curry as well. But again, I don't know if it was because of his reputation or because of the number of people who were killed, prominent people, directly and indirectly connected to the assassination, were gone. And, plus he had a wife and family. I mean, I can't speak for him. Plus, he's gone now. And if he were still here, he still wouldn't change his story. He would not go on record with these feelings that he had. So I'm convinced that that was Lee in that doorway of the Texas School Book Depository, and I believe that Oswald told the truth to the detective in front of Jessie Curry when he said he was on the first floor at the time of the shooting, and was found calmly drinking halfway done with a Coke on the second floor in the lunchroom by building manager Roy Truly and the police officer that had gone up the front steps of the Texas School Depository. And in less than 90 seconds after the last bullet was fired. So Oswald would have had, if he'd been in that 6-floor window, would have had to hide the rifle, so it took some time to find, cross the building, go down 4 flights of stairs because the elevator was still stuck on the 6th floor, run down 4 flights of stairs, bust into the lunchroom on the 2nd floor, and buy a Coke and be halfway done with it, calmly drinking it in less than 90 seconds after the last bullet was fired. Impossible. The FBI couldn't do it. The Warren Commission investigators couldn't do it. And Oswald couldn't do it and didn't do it.
About Margaret's research on her own. Did she ever research at all on her own? I mean, you mentioned that she called you about the HSCA investigation and said they got some things wrong.
She did. She did her best. She wasn't given very much cooperation, of course. I mean, it wasn't in the narrative at the time. But she contacted the State Department. She contacted the Warren Commission investigators. She even contacted the FBI. Ida wasn't privy to those conversations again because I hadn't met her yet. But she was very thorough and completely different from what the press painted her as. I found her to be very warm, kind, generous, and to be completely broke all the time and be as generous as she was and intelligent was just the opposite of what she was painted as being. And there were reports that she didn't get along with Marina. I'll tell you, not one conversation that I ever had with Marguerite did she not have anything but nice things to say about Marina. Missed her, missed the grandkids. It really tore her up inside. In fact, she had less nice things to say about her own son, Robert, because of Robert's attitude about Lee than she did Marina or anyone else for that matter, certainly the grandkids. But and I understood after she passed away she had written a note that if she were to pass away, all of her files were to come to me. So when she passed away in early 1981, I contacted uh, Lee's brother Robert, and he was very rude. He said, "I know who you are, and you're not getting anything." I said, "You found the note that your mom wrote? Yes, but you're not getting anything. Lee did it, and that's it." So I hung up. He was very unreasonable. I think I always got the impression that Robert was jealous of Lee, not because of the attention he got, but because it was obvious to anybody that ever watched Lee be interviewed that he was intelligent and that there could have been something to the theory that he had been involved in intelligence work for the United States.
It's weird that his brother had that reaction, though. I mean, I know his brother to his dying day said Lee did it. I've read that in documents, but I don't know. It's just there's something there, like either it's a fear aspect or something like that. That's the reason why you would double down on your brother, not even look into the possibility of conspiracy unless he did it in secret. And I've heard stories. I think the last time Lee stayed over there briefly for like a little bit of time or something like that with Marina when he came back from Russia. It's the work of Gary Hill in his book The Other Oswald. And there was a knife incident, whether he pulled a knife out. People said like the accounts vary. So I don't know what that, I mean, brothers fight. I have a brother, but just to be that so hostile towards it, even like not giving you any files, that's Marguerite's, just because you're interested in the more conspiracy aspect.
Yeah, and there's been all kinds of conspiracies. Some of them are the most outrageous things I've ever heard in my life. I mean, people trying to make a buck, trying to get publicity. It's really pathetic, and it doesn't do anybody any justice. Certainly doesn't do justice to the case. But I just really think it was embedded in his jealousy of Lee. I mean, I couldn't come up with anything else to attribute it to. But Marguerite had told me that Robert was jealous of Lee long before the assassination even occurred. So it wasn't a surprise to me the way he talked with me on the phone. And I only had that one conversation with him, but he was very arrogant, very short, not very sweet, but he was short. And, he right away said, "I know who you are and you're not getting anything." And so I said, "Well, if you don't want to give it to me, give it to me, give it to the public through me." Um, He said, "No, Lee did it, and you guys got to leave this thing alone." And I thought, this is pretty strange behavior for a so-called beloved brother.
Yeah. Did you ever ask Margaret about either Mark Lane or Ruth Payne at all? Because she fired Mark Lane from representing.
Yeah, I think that she felt betrayed by Mark Lane long after they'd begun. He became Lee's surrogate attorney in death, and but she got nervous. She thought that he was more interested in getting his book published than he was actually trying to help her clear Lee's name. And Mark Lane wasn't the only one who took advantage of her in that regard. So she developed a very leery uh, approach to anybody that tried to interview her and discuss things with her, feeling that they were just going to take advantage of her and that they were more concerned about getting publicity for themselves, whether they were going to write a book or do a television interview, radio interview, newspaper article, just more interested in that than helping her clear Lee's name. She didn't believe in their sincerity after a while, and that's sort of what happened with the relationship with Mark Lane. And you mentioned somebody else?
Ruth Payne.
Pardon me?
Ruth Payne.
She never really said anything derogatory about Ruth Payne, just that she didn't think she helped Lee and thought that she would show more kindness in that regard. But that's the extent. She didn't really go into any detail. One thing I learned about Marguerite, because she was so on guard all the time because of being mistreated and misquoted. And I think that was part of the narrative to make her look like she was some kind of a nut that belonged to Bellevue. But she became leery of people, and she was always on guard. So I didn't. If I got the sense that she was kind of backing off, I didn't pressure her. I let her dictate the narrative. When I did have something to say, I would say so in a respectful way. And 99% of the time, she was very receptive. So because I've done a lot of research myself and seen things that people today have never seen. So like that photograph in the floor of the Keys, for example. And to learn 99.9% certainty who actually was behind that stockade fence is pretty powerful. And that's when I went to Baxter Ward, the old LA County supervisor, former director of news on ABC's West Coast division, had gone to Ed Meese, the Attorney General under Ronald Reagan. And when Ed Meese says, I'm not touching with a 10-foot pole, I'm not carrying this any further myself. I had a couple month old son, and so I sort of backed off for a long time until David Lifton got me more involved again.
Who do you? I hate to ask these questions because, like, who do you think killed Kennedy? But who do you think was? Do you think there's a Secret Service member up there? Who do you think was responsible for firing? I believe a second shot, 100%. I believe a front shot. I'm just curious who you might think it would be, because I usually point to the CIA.
I don't personally believe, because of what I found out, and again, it isn't because I'm some genius researcher. The single biggest piece of where I'm at with this came by accident, purely by accident, because of my relationship with Marguerite Oswald. It was published in a newspaper. The guy who came to me, Dick Margison, who was also investigated, like I said, by the FBI, CIA, Secret Service, and the Warren Commission investigators, that was purely accidental. If he hadn't seen that article, I may never have found him, or he may never have found me, I should say. So as a result, that led one thing to the next. The two people involved with him when he was in the CIA doing electrical surveillance were a guy by the name of Lauren Hall and Larry Howard. And he was like brothers with Larry Howard. And those two guys were working on Operation Mongoose together with him. And then Robert Kennedy terminated Mongoose. So Dick Margison turned to Larry and said, what are you going to do now that the quote unquote war is over? And he said, we're going to do something so huge that the United States of America is going to be forced to back another invasion of Cuba. Within months, Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. Now, Dick Margison ran, and I mean, he lived from one state to the next, to the next, to the next, hiding out from Larry Howard, primarily, as well as Lauren Hall. But Baxter Ward, who again was the West Coast director of ABC News at one time, and then an LA County supervisor, went back to ABC on the West Coast in Burbank, following his stint as an LA County supervisor, to do commentaries. I walked in the house one day after work, and he was doing a commentary on KBC in Los Angeles, and he mentioned the word rifle. So I immediately focused on that interview, that commentary. He discussed a rifle that he'd been told was found in Daley Plaza behind the stockade fence the day after the assassination by the FBI. That rifle had fingerprints that belonged to a partner in a private detective agency in Los Angeles, and that detective agency also owned a pawn shop on the first floor in that same building. Well, one of the partners guy by the name of Hathcock. His fingerprints were all over the inside of that rifle. So the FBI, you own a private detective agency, you have you're fingerprinted. So he went out to Los Angeles, interviewed the guy and asked him why his fingerprints were all over the inside of the rifle. He says, well, these two guys pawned the rifle and a set of golf clubs, and I just took the rifle apart, cleaned it a few times, put it back together, and I was just a gun enthusiast. So he had left fingerprints on the inside. So what happened was I called Baxter Ward and told him a little bit, just enough to get his interest generated. He asked me to bring Margeson to Los Angeles from Orange County, and we went to Burbank. Met in his office. He locked the office door, and Dick Margeson told a story how he worked with Larry Howard and Lauren Hall. And then, following that, we went back a couple more times. He asked for their specific names. Up until this point, Dick Margeson hadn't mentioned who they were. So Baxter, he said, who are these guys? So he said, Lauren Hall and Larry Howard. Baxter Ward opened his desk after unlocking it, handed both of us a copy of affidavits by Hathcock and his partner, signed affidavits showing that the two guys that pawned a rifle instead of golf clubs, that same rifle that was found in Dealey Plaza the day after the assassination, were Lauren Hall and Larry Howard. So at that point, Dick Margeson said, well, what about the Rambler station wagon that everybody talks about, that the police officers saw leaving the scene of the shooting in Dallas? So Dick Margeson gave the license plate of Larry Howard's mother's Rambler station wagon. Baxter Ward checked it out. He never would confirm, but he called me 3 weeks later because he had friends high up in the California DMV. Instead, calling me up 3 weeks later and said, bring Dick up with you. So we went up again, and he said, I'm going to do one more thing, and then I'm done with this myself. I don't want any more to do with this. So whatever he found out through his friend at the DMV, he wanted no more part of this. He said, I said, what are you going to do? He says, I'm going with this to Ed Meese, who is Ronald Reagan's Attorney General of the United States. So a couple weeks later, he comes back, calls me up, bring Dick up. He locks the door. We sit down. I said, okay, what's the deal? And he said that Ed Meese said he wouldn't touch this with a 10-foot pole. Too many people are already dead. They've been involved in this case. I'm not getting involved. That was it. So when Ed Meese, the Attorney General of the United States, said he's done, I'm done. So for the longest time, I stayed out of it. But I missed conversations with Marguerite, and I never really could put it all to rest. I had such a long history of being involved in it, directly, indirectly. I've been followed from her house a few times, Marguerite's house. It's, I'm in my early 20s and being followed from her house to my hotel room, hearing people pacing back and forth in front of my hotel.
Were you followed by reporters or cops?
No, I don't know who it was. You can hear people out there. You say, who's out there? And then all of a sudden it's quiet. You get back into the bed, and all of a sudden you hear people walking back and forth again. So, and then one time I left Marguerite's house in Fort Worth, and I heard an engine down the street, and I'm in a rental car. So I get in my car and I start driving down the street, and that car pulls out. I can hear it, but the lights aren't on. And I get to the Fort Worth Turnpike, and then the lights come on the car behind me. I get on the turnpike, off the turnpike, on the turnpike, off the turnpike, and they do the same thing. So, I wound up having to race around the corner, almost crashed the car at 90 miles an hour trying to get off the turnpike. and they couldn't catch up with me and make that turn, and wound up getting away. But I don't know who they were. I'm maybe 22 years old, 23 years old. Pretty scary stuff for me. So anyway, it's been a lifelong thing. I've never been able to completely put it down. I guess my attitude is just that if you can assassinate the president of the United States in broad daylight in a major city in this country and get away with it, what can they do to the rest of us? And
Deal on that. I gotta ask, I don't know if you asked her this. It's about the Adolphus Hotel. Uh, a reporter had went there and got Marina, the kids, and Margaret, and had like interviewed them. I don't know if you've ever come across that before, but I've seen that a document like that twice, where just a Life reporter, Times Magazine reporter, had got like went picked them up and brought them to the Adolphus Hotel, which I was like, why is a reporter doing this extra mile work?
yeah, there's been controversy over that. I kind of left it alone. When I asked Marguerite about it, she never really said anything. Initially, she thought maybe, and I think this is one of the things that caused her to develop this, you know, back off kind of attitude about being mistreated and taken advantage of. But she initially thought that this person was being nice, was on their side, and she developed over the course of the next few years a very on guard position with anybody that discussed the case. So I left it alone. When she would, like I said before, when she would bring something up, if she would push the issue herself, then I'd get in more detailed conversation with her. But I found her to be very close guarded. She held her cards close to her vest until she became completely comfortable with me. But even then, I visited her numerous times, and but I think there was still a piece of her that was always on guard. Um, Not necessarily to me specifically, but just people in general. When you're painted to be uh, just a complete opposite of what you really truly are, and taken advantage of by every single reporter or writer, newscaster, you develop this on guard attitude.
When did she pass?
It was in early 1981, January, February of 1981.
Was that before or after Oswald was dug up a second time or dug up?
Um, I know he dug up the first time, and that really bothered her. But to tell you the truth, I can't recall if it was after the second time.
What about the
Yeah, I
first
can't
time when
recall. As
he
a matter
was?
of fact, I remember one of the things that upset her was the fact that somebody stole Lee's grave marker, and that really bothered her. So when I first went with her to Lee's cemetery place, there was just one that said just Oswald on it, and that was it. But I heard years later somebody sold it, or I didn't pay much attention to the details, but that was horrific for her. Really brought her to tears.
Did she ever keep hope that the truth would be revealed about what's going on with Lee Harvey Oswald?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Did she ever keep hope that if there was going to be the truth coming out about Lee Harvey Oswald, it's something.
Yeah, she never gave up. I mean, she'd get frustrated. Like I said, during the House Select Committee hearings, she'd call me one day and she'd be really happy at what was um, presented. And then another day, she would be really upset and say, "This is not the truth. I've got proof of this. This is not the truth." They're after my son and they're not going to let him clear his name. But on the other hand, one of the things, by the way, was when the acoustics people went down there, and I was in Dallas, um, and they reenacted the shooting with the microphones along the motorcade route. And the two guys that testified before the House Select Committee initially said there was a 50-50 chance that one of the shots came from behind the stockade fence atop the grassy knoll. So they were pressured by the people who wanted to keep the same narrative that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone assassin. So they went back and further analyzed their data. And then they came back, and I think the committee expected to hear them say, well, it could have been, it couldn't have been, we're not positive. But instead, they said, no, it's a 95% or better possibility that a fourth shot came from behind that stockade fence. And the whole room erupted with all the reporters and television cameras. I mean, it was, and she was obviously pleased by that, because it at least would prove that it wasn't just Lee, even if Lee was involved. And I told her one time that even if Lee had been the assassin and the lone assassin, the way you've been treated is horrible. It's horrific. I mean, I'm sure Charles Manson's parents shouldn't be held accountable for Charles Manson's behavior. So why would Marguerite Oswald or Marina Oswald be held accountable for Lee's actions, even if he did assassinate President Kennedy? So it's just, I'm still hopeful that someday the truth will come out. I don't have any false hopes. I mean, I really don't.
It won't be in your lifetime, and it won't be in my lifetime. I hate to
I
say
don't
it.
believe it will. And President Trump authorized the release of more information. But why would you, if there's nothing to hide, why would you make the archives blocked from releasing certain information if in fact there's nothing to hide? For years and years and years, it doesn't make sense. You can say that there's, that people's reputations might be harmed. Well, so what? So what? You're talking about the assassination of a president of the United States. Who's going to care about their feelings versus finding the truth about who really assassinated President Kennedy? What's more paramount than that? Certainly not their reputations.
It's called national security, is what they call
national security, my butt. Excuse me. Excuse my language. But I mean, it's the narrative they want to keep. I mean, even after the acoustics people testified on their findings, it was hushed up after that. Some phony investigation by the FBI afterward. I mean, they didn't change the narrative, and they weren't going to. And so the public has never been told the entire truth. It hasn't been confirmed, and it's certainly not going to be confirmed by the FBI.
Well, John, I appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show, man. I'm going to have you back on to talk about some of the other subjects you mentioned in the beginning. But where can people find your links, man? Do you have a website, any social links?
Well, they can find my email is JD as in David Mancino, Mancino @yahoo.com. I have my own business, like I said, private security business, so I don't give that email address out. But people can contact me through email. I get literally last weekend in 2 days I got 833 emails. It drives me out of my mind. But
maybe stop giving your email out there. So maybe stop giving your email out there. I would get like a private messenger or something like that. Well, I always get scary with emails.
Yeah, I might have to do that. And I hope people respect the privacy and will only contact me with something serious as opposed to just gabber and stuff. It's even when I unsubscribe to some of these things, they still send them.
They never let you unsubscribe. It's all a lie.
It's a joke. They know the federal government's not going to enforce the issue. These companies set up reserve accounts in case they're sued, and they just keep doing it. Marketing people primarily. But If somebody's serious and they want to talk, I'm willing to do so. Like I said, my primary goal is to, well, in the words of Margaret Oswald, clear the name of Lee Harvey Oswald. And not just that, that's A. B is to find out without a doubt who actually did it. I mean, I'm 99.9% sure I know who fired the bullets that killed Kennedy, at least fired the one from the front that hit Kennedy in the throat and hit him in the head. So, and by the way, the one that hit President Kennedy in the back, the Dallas doctors never knew he had a wound in his back because they never turned him over. The Bethesda doctors who performed the autopsy, they're the ones that found the bullet in the back, bullet wound in the back, and it went in less than finger length deep. So less than finger length deep doesn't add up to being a single bullet theory that went through Kennedy's back, which was 6 inches below the shoulder and just to the right of the spinal column, came out the throat, and then went on to do all the damage to Governor Connolly. What a farce. I mean, that narrative is such a farce. They must think the public is stupid.
Well,
And
Alan
Dr.
Dulles is
McClellan, like I said, Dr.
Alan,
McClellan swore that he would never change his testimony that Kennedy was hit in the throat from the front. It was an entrance wound.
Alan Dulles was the one that said the public doesn't read anyway. So
Yeah. Well, Alan Dulles, if you remember, Alan Dulles is the same Alan Dulles that never told Kennedy until a week or two before the Bay of Pigs about the Bay of Pigs,
and got
because
fired.
Again, Kennedy wasn't supposed to be elected. So Nixon and Eisenhower had planned the Bay of Pigs, not Kennedy. So he gets told at the last second, and they ask him for air and naval support. And he said, "No, I'm not going to give air and naval support. Nobody knows the connection, the true connection between the Soviet Union and Cuba. I'm not going to put the entire United States in line for a possible nuclear war over a tiny island of Cuba. No way." So Kennedy, after it failed, he brings Alan Dulles into his office and said, "I'm going on national television tonight, and I'm going to take full responsibility for this failed effort. But you are fired." So that's the same Alan Dulles that is appointed to the Warren Commission. Give me a break.
John, thank you again for giving me the time, man. I'm gonna link your links in the description. Thanks everybody for listening to this episode of
Please do. Yeah, I'd love to be able to watch it. Thank you very much.
Stay tuned for next